Our next speaker is Frank Birmann from Amsterdam, and the topic of his presentation is agency and accountability in Earth system governance, legal implication and legal challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot very much for the invitation. I must say I have shortened my title on the slides a little bit to make it a bit easier. My name is Frank Birmann. I must say, or might say, that I'm actually not a lawyer. I am a political scientist, but I have studied law a long time ago, like 20 years ago, and at that time, so there's a certain affinity to your community that I still remain, and I'm very keen also and listen to your presentations later and to learn more from the various approaches here at this conference. What I want to do in my presentation is combining a bit the presentation from Carl, some of the presentation from Jonas, add some of my own ideas, especially on the theme of Earth system governance and the legal challenges that come from the challenge of Earth system governance. So, starting a bit to summarize the presentation of Carl in a way, I mean, he has done this much more elaborate, that we have a tremendous challenge ahead of the transformation of the entire Earth system. And I rely here on findings of the Earth System Science Partnership, which is a major network of all the 4 global change research programs, bringing together the findings of the natural sciences, bringing together the findings of the social sciences. And this Earth System Science Partnership argues that the Earth today operates outside the normal state that it has exhibited over the last 500,000 years, that human activities could trigger severe consequences for the environment, and that this could potentially switch the Earth system to alternative modes of operation that might prove irreversible and inhospitable to humans. And this is a bit like the one slide that Carl has showed and that we discussed already before in these presentations. So the conclusion of the Earth System Science Partnership in this context has been, and this is all on their website, www.esp.org, is that what we need now urgently are strategies for Earth system management. And if you see this mission statement of the Earth System Science Partnership, this is essentially the core line that addresses the legal sciences and political sciences. Earth system management is a difficult term. It's not acceptable to many social sciences, because it has connotations in many of our communities with hierarchical, technocratic, and top-down approaches. So therefore, many people in the community have chosen the term Earth system governance, which is a term much more reflective of the challenge of decentralized, non-hierarchical, cooperative solutions to the challenge of Earth system transformation. So this is, in a way, the talk that I want to deliver in the next 20 minutes about the challenge of the legal challenges of Earth system management. We have arrived, as Carl pointed out, in the Anthropocene. So we have left, in a way, a planetary area which was the Holocene, and we have arrived in a new area which is now defined, as Paul Crutzen termed the coin, by the impact of the human species, the Anthropocene. And the key challenge that I want to discuss here is what is the new role of law in this Anthropocene? I mean, how can law and lawyers respond to these challenges of Earth system transformation and a new planetary area that is defined by the human species? And I want to follow in my presentation the outline of a science plan that has been developed by the Earth System Governance Project, which is a 10-year research program that has been launched in 2008 under the auspices of the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environmental Change, and it will last until 2018. We have a website, earthsystemgovernance.org, and in this project we propose to organize research on Earth system governance according to 5 analytical themes, which is the architecture of Earth system governance, agency in Earth system governance of states, non-state actors, adaptiveness of governance systems, accountability and legitimacy, and also questions of allocation and access. So these are the 5 core themes that the Earth System Governance Project wants to analyze, and I have a couple of slides in which I try to address the legal impacts, the legal implications of these 5 analytical themes. Let me start with the first, the overarching architectures of Earth System Governance, and here the role of legal science. And I think one of the key challenges here for policymakers, but also for scholars dealing with these issues, is the challenge or the dichotomy between fragmentation and integration. We have here a tremendous amount of international institutions in various issue areas of Earth system governance, on desertification, climate, waste, air pollution, etc., etc. And this has been widely studied by students of Earth system governance in the past. But the key challenge that we have now, I believe, is to understand the overarching architecture on how all these institutions are linked together and how they form a coherent whole. In a way, the challenge is to what extent do all these various 900 environmental treaties that we have form something that you can describe as something like a coherent, consistent Renaissance palace, as I've shown here. And this is something what I think that lawyers like. I mean, they like kind of that all forms together such as like a palace in a quite a consistent way. And maybe some of you are not agreeing with this. But we all know also from empirical experience that the world is different. If you compare the overarching architecture of Earth system governance with a Renaissance palace, we would see this rather a palace that has been affected by at least 20 earthquakes. So we are affected by a large number of instances of horizontal fragmentation and also vertical fragmentation, where institutions are not integrated, where they're not properly linked, and where there's lots of conflict between norms at different levels and on a horizontal scale. So here, the question is, to what extent is this really a problem? This is an analytical question. Is fragmentation of the architecture of Earth system governance really a problem? This is the first analytical question, and then if you would agree that this is a problem, the question is also, of course, a political question. What institutional mechanisms are available to make this fragmented system more consistent and more coherent? And here you find in literature, and this I think is both in political science, in the policy community, but also partially in the legal community, a number of arguments that speak in favor of fragmentation. I mean, it's not called fragmentation, and it's called diversity, plurality, orchestra of treaties, etc., where people argue that many smaller agreements may be faster to negotiate. If you have only small agreements, it's much easier to get them into force and negotiate it first. That many smaller agreements together might be also easier to implement, and that smaller agreements might also be more progressive, because here you don't need always to have the least demanding denominator. Then also fragmented architectures might allow also for side payments, that countries can strike deals much easier if it's only a few countries involved. Or the argument is that it might allow the integration, or might help the integration of non-state actors, and it might also increase innovation through competition, that you have in a way many, many different regimes, and in all these small agreements new ideas might pop up and might then be diffused around the globe to all the other regimes. This is something that might not be possible if you have one consistent harmonized system where only one idea in a way has a chance. And then the last argument is also, and this is very much based also on experiences from Copenhagen, where this argument is very much pushed forward, that small agreements might help to circumvent negotiation stalemates. These are all a number of arguments in favor of fragmentation, and we in our group have looked at these arguments and compared them also with a number of disadvantages that come with fragmentation of architectures. That of course a fragmented regime serves only particular interest. That is especially the more powerful countries that have more bargaining power, that they can push through their agendas, and that small countries or small actors, weaker actors, they have much less opportunities to pursue their own interest in a fragmented system. So quite often you will find stronger actors to be more in favor of a fragmented system than weaker actors who seek universal regimes to protect their own interests better. It favors a short-term orientation, because the long-term goals might get out of sight. It might undermine the momentum for larger deals and also reduce your options for package deals. Because the big agreements that are really sometimes required, especially in issues of Earth system governance, they might not be possible if the pressure is taken away by smaller agreements that are short-term solutions, but then for the short-term stable, but unstable for the long time. They might complement linkages with other regimes and might create a regulatory chaos with no clear signals, and also increase global negotiation costs. So these are a number of arguments that are speaking against fragmentation, that are arguing in favor of a more integrated approach. And we have looked at these things in quite a detail, including with participatory approaches, policy analysis, legal studies, and modeling studies also. And our finding is large by large that fragmentation is rather something to be avoided in the long term, that an overall long-term stable institutional framework that binds all nations is crucial, and that these bilateral, regional, or issue-specific arrangements that are now being discussed, especially in the climate arena, that they are maybe important supplements, they may be important as complements to a larger agreement, but they're not alternatives. So the overall goal, the overall stability that Earth system governance requires at the global level requires an overarching stable institutional framework, and this must be the most important goal. So many of the problems that have been quoted with the UN system in particular. I mean, after Copenhagen, the climate arena, there was a lot of UN bashing, where many people said this is caused, especially because negotiations were being held in the UN system. We believe this is a flawed argument by and large, and that the key issues are distributive conflicts, but not necessarily flaws in the negotiation system per se. So this is horizontal fragmentation. We have this all laid out in some more papers that I can send you. I have not that much time to lay this out here in more detail. And on vertical fragmentation, this is especially from the perspective of law, I would argue, and this comes later in some presentations, the question of sovereignty. And there are much more experienced lawyers here in the room that will lay this out in their presentation. I want to be very short, but just to symbolize from a non-legal perspective in a way how this looks like. I mean, this is how Carl Volcker could lay this out in much more detail, how the entire global system is structured as an independent system of the entire planetary systems. And if you look at this from outer space in a way, suppose you would come from outer space and would look at the system and would ask the question, how do you guys organize this? And then this would be the answer. In a way, it just looks bizarre. So this is kind of one little comment in a way of the relevance of sovereignty. And I believe if you really want to prevent the types of transformations that Carl has talked about, then we really have to discuss also sovereignty, which sounds very naive on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think this is an important agenda for international lawyers to kind of develop new ideas and findings in this area, because this is certainly not a sustainable political arrangement. Good. So this is kind of legal scholarship on meta-norms is important. I think this is actually an important contribution that international legal scholars can pay to this community of Earth system governance research. The second point that I want to make is about agency in Earth system governance. Who are the agents that are driving Earth system governance and that can maybe help prevent these changes that we have heard about before? And this is an important research agenda, not only regarding the state, but also regarding the non-state. And I want to briefly reflect on three agents. And the first is the state agents. And here I think, we have a lot of writings we have on the green state, ecological state, environmental state. This has all been studied, it's still very important. But I think here an important research agenda is to go forward in understanding an adaptive state. And here I don't mean necessarily small adaptation, as it has sometimes been discussed in the national context, but a bit in line with Carl's talk this morning, large-scale adaptation, in a way that, as sometimes been quoted by Bob Watson, for example, from the UK, who said that we have to target politically 2-degree warming, but have to prepare politically for 4-degree. And this, I think, is an important challenge also for lawyers to understand to what extent you have to change state functions and national legal systems, also international legal systems, to possibly react to surprises that might be in the system that we don't know yet, the unknowns, the unknown unknowns, and how can we really change our systems in a way to make them much more resilient, much more adaptive to large-scale changes in the overall system. And this, I think, is a big research, and it's a bit difficult, of course, maybe for lawyers, because lawyers are by definition conservative and have to rely on state action. So, but I think it's also very important to think ahead. And certain tensions that are there, for example, between the effectiveness on decision-making and the accountability and legitimacy. Because large-scale environmental changes will require quick action, and here the question is to what extent can you guarantee the legitimacy and the accountability of quick decision-making in times of drastic and fast-moving on environmental change. Other questions are tensions between effectiveness and the justice of decision-making, the distributive outcomes of decision-making. These are also important questions that need to be addressed, and we think about the legal consequences, legal implications of an adaptive state. And a second actor that is becoming more important is our intergovernmental organizations. And here I can just say there's a huge surge of new studies in political science. I mean, international relations is now full with new studies, books, articles on international intergovernmental organizations, which was a little bit something you did not do in the 1990s. It was not really part of the large mainstream, but now it becomes the main issue. But here the question is, to what extent can lawyers and international relations scholars work together here? I've been involved in one research project here on managers of global change, the influence of international environment bureaucracies, where we try to study, to use also legal literature, but it was difficult. And one reason, I think, is the difference in the understanding of these actors, where political scientists have a functional understanding, and lawyers, especially legal literature, is very much based on legal understanding. So we have studied, that's also why we didn't use the word organizations, because most of the actors we looked at, they were not organizations in the legal understanding. We looked at the Global Environment Facility, we looked at secretariats of treaties, we also looked at intergovernmental organizations, and we all compared them across the board without taking into account the different legal statutes. Actually, our finding is that legal statutes does not matter that much, actually. So here we thought that the legal literature is difficult to combine with political science literature because of the strong attention lawyers pay to the legal statutes of these kind of bureaucracy. That's why we use the term also bureaucracies. And here I don't have a solution, but maybe some of the lawyers here that can reflect on this and see how can we bring this together, and is there any way of kind of better integrating the two strands of research beyond the divide of a functional and a legal conceptualization of international bureaucracies. And then the third actor that is very much discussed now, I think is also becoming more important, are private actors. It's not only NGOs, it's also institutions that are carried forward by private actors. For example, the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, many other labeling schemes where non-state actors, NGOs in industry and other societal actors are working together to set international standards, which are somehow effective on us in a way. So somehow people accept, obey the standards that are set up at an international level without involvement of states. And this is a fascinating development. And this is, especially in the social sciences, is a huge fashion in a way also. I think sometimes too much attention is being paid to these kind of mechanisms. But this is something also maybe interesting for a debate between lawyers and political scientists, to what extent can we understand these new types of transnational governance. And I give one example. We have looked in some detail at public-private partnerships, especially those that came out of the Johannesburg summit, where intergovernmental agreements were not possible, and they had these type 2 outcomes. 330 public-private partnerships at the transnational level. And the argument of supporters of these mechanisms is that these are very important new mechanisms at the international level, because they resolve a regulatory deficit that we have, where the states can't regulate international issues. Their partnerships step in. Where there are intergovernmental agreements, but they're not effective, partnerships can step in and resolve this implementation deficit. Or participation deficit, partnerships help to bring in marginalized actors. They bring in the voices of those who are underrepresented and not really involved in intergovernmental decision making. So this is the positive arguments. But then there's also a critique of these partnerships, seeing them as privileging the more powerful actors, seeing them as agencies that bring forward the privatization of governance, and also as bodies that lack accountability. So we tried to understand this, and we built a database in which we put in data of 332 partnerships in a way, and tried to answer these questions. And one example is, I mean, our findings are pretty pessimistic in a sense, or critical, whatever, so one of the findings is that the theoretical claim is the implementation deficit, that these partnerships especially fulfill the needs of developing countries. But then you find in the database that most partnerships are not really initiated by countries, but rather by international organizations, by OECD countries, and by large transnational governmental organizations. So they are not driven in the majority from developing countries and from their NGOs and associations. So by and large, our finding is that regarding the regulatory deficit, that partnerships are here not predominantly active in areas where regulation is weak. They are active in those areas where there is also intergovernmental activity. Implementation deficit. Partnerships are often underfinanced, and quite often they're not there. And this is quite an interesting finding when you do research. I mean, if you do research on intergovernmental treaties, at least the treaty is there. It might be not effective, but you find the treaty somewhere. But in the partnership, I mean, 1/3 of these partnerships, you just don't find them. So we had to code in our database what we called non-operational partnerships. That means there's no telephone number, there's no website, there's no person, there's no information whatsoever available, except that somehow in the UN database, in the UN system, they are registered. But this was the last thing anybody has ever heard about these bodies. I mean, this is a little bit too critical, maybe. I mean, of course, some of them are great. I'm talking about statistical results of a database, so that the majority is debatable and quite a large minority is not there. And regarding the participation deficit, it's the same. That also here, many partnerships appear to reflect existing constellations of power and engagement. Many of them are driven by the big NGOs, by the big intergovernmental organizations, and by the OECD countries, in particular the big ones. And it's not necessarily so that partnerships increase the voice and the participation of otherwise marginalized actors. So here we are pretty critical. There's a book about this anyway. So more or less our finding is that the entire system, I don't have much time for detail here, the entire system of private governance is maybe not living up to the expectation and the hype that you find today in the literature. That the partnerships, limited effects. Also other studies have looked at voluntary carbon market, which is important, but maybe not the solution to all the challenges of Earth system governance. City networks, I mean, there are many of these new types of agreements that many people see as a hope for resolving challenges of Earth system governance, and here we are rather critical. So another argument that is also related to this criticism are lacks of accountability. And this is a larger question that Earth system governance poses new questions of accountability and legitimacy at the national level. I talked about the adaptive state already, but especially also at the international level, where you have to define in a way where more and more decisions are being taken at this level of intergovernmental conferences and in agreements and in conference of the parties, etc. So here, the more decisions are being taken here, the more we have to be able to answer how these bodies can be held accountable and where the legitimacy from these bodies comes from. This is one question. I don't address this question actually here because I'm more interested in private accountability. And this is not necessarily a legal question here, because this is a question of accountability of the press. CNN, New York Times, I mean, these are important actors to shape the way how we understand the world. But where's accountability coming from? NGOs, Bill Gates, all business actors, big foundations. These are kind of important questions, especially for political scientists, maybe less for the lawyers. But I think one thing where also lawyers, I think, can contribute a lot is the development of these new types of transnational, what we call transnational organizations, such as the Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, which are totally private. I mean, there's no states are involved. I mean, sometimes they're a little bit involved, sometimes they're formally excluded. They're totally private, but they came up with organizational diagrams like this, which looks, I mean, for those you can't see this. I mean, for you it looks like the UN. No? It looks like a UN organization. It's not. It's totally private. But in some way of mimicking, they came up with similar institutional solutions with boards and trustees and stakeholder councils, various chambers. They have different, I mean, it's not one country, one vote. It's then one interest, one vote. They have different environmental chamber, social chamber, northern chamber, southern chamber. Very interesting stuff. But this is something that's very important to understand also, first, how this functions. And I don't know actually what the term is. I mean, how lawyers call this. I mean, this is private, but it's not really private law. I mean, it's because it's a public function. So it's some form of private-public law or whatever. I think it's or private constitutional law for public goods. I think this is a very interesting field of understanding, because this is, of course, a type of law. I mean, these are kind of standards of behavior that these guys all accept. And my point is the accountability is this woman is voting. And there is an accountability because these larger bodies are held accountable to constituency, like an NGO, like an industry, like a fishery organization, like a corporation, those who pay for these institutions. There is a certain link in the terms of being held accountable. But the point is, how are these people then held accountable by us? And this is a big challenge. I mean, where is the legitimacy coming from NGO, from industry, science, and whatever, so that are involved and represented in these bodies? Because these bodies represent civil society, which means us. But to what extent can we kind of hold our representatives accountable when they do this? And the point is that we believe that, despite my general criticism that the entire transnational governance makes not a big difference, that nonetheless there is a certain effectiveness of these bodies, and this makes them important areas for study and further analysis. And one solution I had, what I want to research actually in the future a bit more, is to what extent we can find a compromise by including civil society in a much more meaningful way in intergovernmental decision making. Because right now civil society involvement is symbolic. It looks great when you go to the conference of the parties. I mean, so colorful, everybody running around, and you really think it's like Woodstock. But it's not. It's colorful, but meaningless. And this is kind of important in a sense, because in decisions, as we all know, are being taken by Barack Obama and whoever else, whatever. So who are sitting then in restaurants and under dark glasses, whatever, and taking the decisions. So the question is, to what extent can we legalize, institutionalize involvement in civil society? And there are examples. I mean, the ILO is, of course, well known, where NGOs have voting rights, but we also know that the ILO example we can't really use for environmental purpose because it's so simple. There you have labor and capital. That's very black and white, or whatever, or both black or both white, whatever. But there's very clear dichotomy. And this you don't have when we talk about Earth system governance. So one thing what we have is a CSD with a major groups concept. This is kind of a way of making it a bit more complex, where you have major groups, the farmers, or the youth, wherever. But then it becomes also much more complicated again, because the youth is represented, but not the elderly. You know? So I feel sometimes increasingly no longer represented by these bodies in a way. So, no? Or the farmers are represented, but not the fishers, or whatever, or the shoemakers, or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting way. You increase the complexity of representation, but to what extent can you really develop this in a stable solution? I think that's an important research frontier, and I find this extremely fascinating to think about types of NGO, civil society representation in intergovernmental decision making. I think if it would work, it had a lot of benefits, and it would help also to increase the speed and the progressiveness of intergovernmental decision making. Good, the last point that I want to make is, in the end, I mean, Keynes said in the long run we are all dead, and in the end I think we have to also talk much more systematically about adaptation. And here especially, I mean, I mentioned the adaptive state at the national level, especially we have to think about changes in the intergovernmental system because of large-scale environmental change. Because we are all optimists and we believe that Karl's graph will all kind of stabilize for the next 500 years, whatever, so nothing will happen. But we also have to understand that system changes are an historical fact, and we don't know what the future brings. We know the last, 5,000 years were kind of okay, but we don't know when we continue, how we'll continue. So we have to think about adaptation. I quoted Bob Watson again, I like this quote very much. Target the 2 degrees in climate change, but prepare for the 4 degrees. And the question is for political scientists, but also then for the international lawyers and national lawyers and whoever, how do we do this? I mean, suppose in 50 years we have 4-degree warming. What does it mean for international law, put simply? What does it mean for the United Nations? What does this mean for all kinds of legal systems and legal questions? And we have started looking at these issues, especially with the view of climate refugees, which I think is the most important consequence of climate change, maybe. You can also look at food. I mean, Karl mentioned in one of his slides, of course, that agriculture is not possible under all climate systems. So food is certainly also very much affected, water and many other things. But we started to look at climate refugees, where you find a large number of predictions on climate refugees, which are totally different. I mean, you find, just show you these numbers, there's no truth in them. These are all projections. I mean, no projections are always somewhat wrong because they're all based on models and whatever, so nobody knows the future. And the range is, I mean, the offers are 1 billion according to Christian Aid by 2050, or somewhat like hundreds of millions according to a Stern report. So there are lots of numbers in the game. I don't know what will happen. What I know is that all the scenarios are coming down to large numbers. I mean, 200 million refugees by 2050 will mean it's 20 times more than what is currently covered by the UNHCR. You can also call them climate migrants. I know lawyers that don't like the word climate refugees because of the Refugee Convention or whatever. So I think this is kind of what normal people would describe as a refugee. People who have to leave their places because they can't live there anymore. Then the current system. So what is the current system? And the current system is the UNHCR, and this is, I mean, we all probably know, this is, does not cover climate refugees. There are some very elaborate legal studies on the market in a way where people argue you could put some climate refugees under the Geneva Convention, for example, if you define them as an ethnic group, or if you define climate change as state persecution, whatever. So, or you see them as a social minority because in some countries the poor people live in the low-lying areas, so you could say this is kind of a form of they are a social group that is persecuted, but I don't think that these kind of legal arguments are really carrying us further. So one argument was made some time ago by the Maldives that the Geneva Convention should be amended. And I think, I mean, to include climate refugees. And I think this is the wrong way forward. It's totally unfeasible, I believe. It's also not very effective given this current type of what the UNHCR is doing. And I think also the Geneva Convention is the wrong system for climate refugees, because the basic idea behind the Geneva Convention is, and the UNHCR is, that people leave their country, they're outside their own country, and their own government is, I mean, they have a problem with their own government, which is different from climate refugees, because here normally most of them are most likely to stay in their own country. Most of them will continue to rely on the protection of their government. It's just the capacities of the governments are lacking in many cases. So here is not the question to help people against their governments. The question is to help the governments to help the relocation of these people. And there are many other arguments in a sense why the Geneva system is not the right system to deal with climate change-related migration. So what we came up with a little proposal, I mean, you can change the names or whatever, but we think the way forward is linking this entire debate to the UN Climate Convention as a protocol on recognition, protection, and resettlement of climate refugees. To recognize them, give them even a legal title in a way, protect them, and to some extent those that cannot be protected by adaptation measures anymore, like small island states, for example, here also one has to think about voluntary resettlement of these communities. And we have laid this out in some more detail, decision-making procedures, ways on how to fund this. Also, of course, sovereignty is very important, and I'm lacking here the time to lay this out. I mean, we have some papers where we have this, and this is a fascinating debate, actually. I mean, there are a couple of groups. There's a French group that is now developing an international convention. I think there are 3 quite elaborate proposals on a climate refugee convention or protocol in the system, and some small island states are now really taking this up. It becomes quite interesting. The Tuvalu or so, they're really trying to get in this debate, and I think it's one of the interesting areas to look forward to. Well, there's another book. Anyway, this is all that little joke here, and well, long-term Brazilian from the Holland. No, we are preparing our welfare. So this was kind of my talk in a way. I have a little, so Holland will always be there. No? Good. A little advertisement in a way for the Earth System Governance, because also the Earth System Governance is supporting this conference. I mean, we are mentioned there somewhere in the program that we are also somewhat involved, because we believe this conference is very important also for the Earth System Governance project, which is, as I mentioned already, a 10-year activity where the legal input is still a little bit not fully developed yet. So I think any lawyers who are interested in these issues of Earth System Governance are very welcome to work. We have a science plan in different languages, actually. The Spanish sounds, I don't speak Spanish, but it sounds most impressive, actually. And it's all downloadable at our website. And we have a global alliance of research centers, and here the important link is that Stockholm Resilience Center is an active partner. So we are working very closely together, and I think the input of Stockholm is very important also in our project. So anything else is on our website, and I thank you very much and looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
So thank you very much. There were a number of issues that linked into law very nicely, and we have a couple of minutes for questions.
just a clarification, Barbara Woodward. On the study, did a public-private partnerships, were they just public-private partnerships in the environmental context, or was it broader than that?
We took all. The entire WHAP.
Because I thought there were a lot more than 300.
No,
I mean, right after Africa, there were about 300, and there are a lot more, I think, since then, under the Commission on Sustainable Development.
Well, we had a cut-off point at one point, but we took essentially all. Not the very recent ones, because at some point you have to stop them. But we took them all, not only environment, also because you can't really define environment in these matters. No? So we looked at all these climate change, water, health, whatever it is. No? So we did not look at those that are maybe effectively did not look at those that are not part of the UN database. No? I mean, there are many of them like driven by industry. They're not registered with UN, and they're then not fully integrated in our system yet. It's a modular system, so people can also join data and contribute more data.
Is that online, or is it just the book? Where your results are
It's not online yet. No. Yeah.
You went through that slide very quickly.
Oh yeah, well, this is actually a book where this is not only about the database. We have a new book forthcoming next year, which is only about the database, and some other articles about the construction. We have also a constructivist PhD student, a great person, analyzing the construction of the partnership discourse from various sources. You mentioned source as a metaphor, but I'm happy to just to send you more information.
So that was one of those books that were not like product placed in his presentation very neatly for 3 seconds, marketing the books. Very nice. One or two more questions, and then we will move on to the next one. Please.
Yes, Bonnie McKay from Rutgers University in the U.S. Thanks very much for a really provocative talk. Maybe you've also written a book about climate refugees that cannot stay in their own countries. But anyway, I wonder, you mentioned that most will want to, but I do think it is also a big legal question of what rights people have or what obligations other countries have to take climate refugees.
Well, I mean, this is, we believe, the current assumption is that maybe 10% of climate refugees, migrants, will leave the country. I mean, most of the people affected will be probably India, China, where you have domestic migration, but there are certain places which just are too small. I mean, the island states are the best known example. I mean, Tuvalu, whatever, these countries. I mean, at one point I talked to the ambassador from Tuvalu. There's not much you can say, actually. Just, I mean, good luck, whatever. And this is, so here you definitely talk about international migration. And this is, of course, an important question. Our approach is not to distinguish. So our approach is to have one legal agreement that covers them all, and that has a number of measures that are then tailor-made for the particular person. That means for those people who stay in their own countries, you have a system of international support in helping reintegration, buying land, whatever, so on a long-term basis. Because the good part about the story is we can plan ahead. Because we know, in a way, because political refugees, you can't plan ahead, technically. I mean, you don't know where the next civil war is. I mean, there are some studies, whatever, about areas where wars might happen, whatever. So, but technically, we don't know where in 20 years the hotspots of political migration will be, political refugees. But for climate change, we can just listen to Carl's presentation. And then I mean, these are the areas, if something goes wrong, it's this, and this country. This is very simple. So here you can plan. And in 2050, unless science changes or we all, whatever, stop emitting CO2, in 2050, certain places are just simply being flooded. So therefore, we don't think in terms of this disaster relief camps, whatever, this kind of UNHCR approach. We think about long-term development projects in a way that bring people from A to B to safer places. And there we think it's not important to make a difference between transnational and domestic migration. There are certain issues we just don't touch upon because we know that lawyers will resolve this beautifully, like the state succession. What do you do when the passport is gone or whatever? So, and there's some lawyers, I mean, that's really kind of nice. What happens with the nation of Tuvalu? Legally, I mean, whatever. So, I mean, is then government in exile and who's giving the passports, whatever. So this is kind of, because this is unprecedented in legal terms. I mean, there's of course states that kind of disappeared as a historical fact, but because of climate change, this had never happened so far. Anyway, so these things we didn't touch upon because politically this is a marginal problem, and complex.
Okay, so when priests and medicines can't solve it, lawyers will solve it. We have time for one last tiny question. I think over there was one before, wasn't it? I think.
Sorry, my question is about internally displaced people. And one of the impacts of climate change is that our responses are going to lead to displacement, whether it be for adaptation through dam constructions or RED programs and so on. And I wondered how you thought about that and whether you addressed it all within this framework of climate refugees.
Well, the question is yes and no. We thought about it and we have not addressed it. And we have in this larger paper that we have a definition of climate refugees for the purposes of this political mechanism that we propose, and they'll be excluded. These indirect effects, which is, civil war, mitigation programs, mitigation of climate change, like a dam, whatever that is meant to for hydropower, but leads also to migration. We excluded this. The thing is still important, but I think you should have a different political mechanism for these type of migrants. So the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
In this order.
So, thank you very much. Those of you who had more questions, you can grab him during the reception afterwards to question and comment on what he said. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thanks a lot.